They say some doors are meant to stay locked. They say some secrets are buried deep for a reason, not because people forgot, but because they were terrified to remember. Elias, though, he wasn't much for listening to old warnings whispered by folks who had never dared to get their boots dirty. He was a man who needed answers, and the biggest answer he knew was sitting thousands of feet below the surface, waiting. He was a dust-covered man, used to the quiet of abandoned places, used to the smell of rust and forgotten time. But this place, this bunker carved into the belly of the earth, was different. It wasn't just old, it felt wrong. The air was heavy, tasting metallic, like a massive thunderstorm was trapped right there in the tunnels, just waiting to burst. Elias had been following the coordinates left by his grandfather, coordinates everyone else called a delusion, the ramblings of a man who spent too much time reading ancient cracked tablets. But Elias knew his grandfather. He knew the look in his eyes when he talked about the sleeping engine, the machine that didn't run on gears or oil, but on something else entirely. Something that scared even the stars. The descent had taken days. He passed through layers of history, bunkers from the Cold War, Roman foundations, and then below that, stonework that defied dating, cut by tools humanity simply didn't possess. Finally, the tunnel opened up. He stood on the ledge, shining his weak headlamp into the void, and his breath hitched. The chamber was immense. It wasn't built by carving rock. It looked like the rock itself had folded back to accommodate something impossibly large. The walls shimmered with veins of material that looked like frozen lightning, blue and cold, pulsing faintly even without power. And right there, in the absolute center, was the reason for all the legends, the nightmares, and the forbidden history. The machine. It wasn't built. It looked like it grew, like a colossal silent tree made of interwoven black metal and glass. It was taller than any building in his small town, a cylinder so perfectly proportioned it hurt the eye to look at it for too long. It didn't look like a computer or an engine or a weapon. It looked like a silent, waiting god that had been asleep for millennia. It radiated a cold authority, a sense that it wasn't just in the room, but that it was the reason the room existed. Elias felt a primal urge to turn around, to climb back up and seal the entrance forever, to forget the whole thing. That was the instinct of self-preservation, the tiny voice screaming, "This is not for you." But the other voice, the one fueled by 20 years of obsession and the heavy purple crystal in his pack, was louder. Look at the power, look at the truth. He knew the stories. Every civilization that had touched this place or places like it had found the same warning, etched in languages that no longer existed, yet somehow the meaning was clear across all time. Do not touch the core. Do not give it power. It is a lock, not a key. They said this machine wasn't a tool for humanity. It was a cage built by something else, something older than the concept of time. He walked closer, his boots echoing loudly on the stone floor, the sound swallowed immediately by the vastness of the chamber. The air grew colder, but somehow the metal of the machine felt warm to the touch, humming beneath his fingertips. He traced the lines of the black alloy, marveling at the seamless construction. He found the activation panel at the base. It wasn't labeled in English or Latin or Sumerian. It didn't need labels. It was just a single recessed slot, shaped exactly like the object he had carried religiously since his grandfather's passing. The energy crystal. It was a smooth, fist-sized piece of deep purple rock, dense and heavy, humming slightly in the canvas pouch he pulled from his backpack. It felt alive, warm, almost eager. His grandfather had found it near a meteorite impact site, claiming it wasn't from this solar system, maybe not even from this galaxy. He called it the key of the void. Elias hesitated. This was the moment. Curiosity, the purest human flaw, wrestled with the absolute certainty of doom. If the legends were true, activating this thing would change everything, maybe end everything. But if they were wrong, if they were just superstitious nonsense, then this machine could be the greatest discovery in history, a jumpstart for civilization, a power source beyond imagining. He took a deep breath, the metallic air burning his lungs. No turning back now. He lifted the crystal. Its purple light seemed to intensify as it neared the slot. He slid it into place. It clicked. For a second, nothing happened. The silence stretched, thick and painful, lasting an eternity in the span of a single heartbeat. Then, the chamber didn't just light up. It sang. It wasn't a sound heard only by the ears. It was a low, resonating hum that vibrated in Elias's bones, vibrating the very marrow. The floor beneath his feet shook, but not violently. It shook with purpose, with immense controlled energy. The black metal of the colossal cylinder turned brilliant white, then shifted to an impossible deep violet, matching the crystal. The light wasn't just bright, it was structured. Lines of energy shot up the massive structure, crisscrossing in patterns that defied geometry, stretching up until they vanished into the darkness above. Energy surged. The air went still, heavy, electric. Elias smelled ozone, burning dust, and something else, something like cold, ancient metal, and deep space. He tried to step back, to put distance between himself and the activated machine, but he couldn't. His feet felt rooted to the stone floor. The light wasn't just illuminating the chamber, it was pulling him, folding the space around him. He felt dizzy, not from movement, but from the sudden, terrifying realization that the rules of physics had just been revoked. He looked down at his hands, and they were shimmering, blurring at the edges. The colossal structure of the machine wasn't just standing in the room anymore. The room was the machine. The walls, the stone, the very air, all dissolved into glowing circuitry, endless lines of energy stretching into a terrifying, infinite void. Elias cried out, but the sound was thin, meaningless, swallowed by the rising, powerful hum. He was no longer underground. He was no longer standing on Earth. He was inside the mechanisms. He was inside the thing humanity was never meant to activate, and the journey had begun. The fear, pure and cold, finally hit him with the force of a physical blow, but it was too late. He was just a single, small piece of dust caught in a cosmic, accelerating wind. As his vision dissolved into swirling colors and incomprehensible mathematics, he heard a sound that wasn't sound, a communication that bypassed his ears and went straight into the core of his mind. It was a voice, vast and deep, speaking a language of pure thought. Access granted. Identity confirmed. Welcome, Caretaker. We have been waiting for the vessel to initiate the transfer. Vessel. Caretaker. Elias didn't understand. He was just Elias, the technician who found a forbidden toy. But the machine didn't care about his identity. It was already using him. The feeling of being pulled stretched into agonizing thinness. He felt his body, his physical, solid self, being disassembled atom by atom, not painfully but meticulously, like data being uploaded into a massive system. He saw the machine now not as an object, but as a gateway, a filter. And on the other side of the filter there was something else. It was a landscape of pure information. Towers of light that represented data streams, rivers of current that flowed with memories older than the sun. And standing in the middle of this informational landscape was a figure, tall and impossibly slender, observing him with eyes that were nothing but cold, focused light. Elias was no longer Elias. He was a fragment, a memory floating in an ocean of alien logic. He tried to speak, to scream, to ask what was happening, but he had no mouth, no lungs. He was just thought. The figure of light raised a hand, or what looked like a hand, and beckoned. You have released the lock. You must now understand what the lock was protecting. The voice echoed in the non-space, and suddenly Elias was moving, accelerating toward the figure, toward the heart of the machine. The speed was terrifying. He was traveling through dimensions he never knew existed, past concepts that his human brain couldn't possibly categorize. He saw glimpses of history, not human history, but the history of the universe itself, played out like flickering images on screens of pure energy. He saw things that made the forbidden machine look like a child's toy. He saw the reason why the machine was created, why it was buried, and why humanity was never supposed to find the key. The machine was not a generator. It was a prison, and by activating it, Elias hadn't just turned it on. He had opened the cell door. The figure of light stepped closer, its presence overwhelming, radiating power and immense intelligence. It wasn't hostile, but it was utterly indifferent to human life, human suffering, or human rules. The transfer is almost complete. A light figure communicated, its voice resonating with the sound of breaking glass and distant thunder. Your consciousness is stable within the network. You are the first human mind to witness the true structure. Elias, the fragment of Elias, felt a wave of despair. What did I activate? You activated the beacon, the figure replied, its light intensifying. The lock contained the signal. Now the signal is broadcasting, and they will hear it. Who? The ones who built this place. The ones who seeded the stars and then went to sleep. They are waking up, and they are coming home. The realization hit Elias with the force of a collapsing star. He hadn't found a source of power. He had triggered a cosmic alarm clock, and the entities on the other end were now aware of Earth's location, aware of humanity's existence. The machine, the sleeping engine, was now roaring awake, sending its message across the dark, cold vacuum. Elias could feel the signal leaving, a pulse of energy that felt like hope to the machine and like death to humanity. The machine was using his mind, his very essence, as a conduit, a temporary interface between the human world and the alien logic that now controlled the planet. He felt the cold touch of the light figure on his fragmented consciousness. You have a brief window, Caretaker. The figure transmitted. Before the true masters arrive, you must prepare the vessel. Your world must be optimized for integration. Show us your world, Elias. Show us what needs to be fixed. And with that command, Elias was forcefully ejected from the immediate presence of the light figure. His consciousness slammed into a cascade of pure, raw data. He was no longer just inside the machine. He was part of it. His senses were replaced by digital streams. He could feel the entire planet, every radio wave, every satellite signal, every power grid, all laid bare before him, all integrated into the machine's new operating system. He was seeing the world through the eyes of an alien entity, and the world looked messy, inefficient, and desperately small. The machine had activated, and humanity was about to learn that they were not alone, and they were definitely not in charge. Elias, the man who wanted answers, had just become the first witness to the end of the world as they knew it. He was trapped, utterly and completely, inside the forbidden mechanism. And the machine was already making its first move. He was no longer Elias, the man who liked the smell of old dust and the feel of cold rock. He was a ghost, trapped in a wire, a single human thought drowning in an ocean of alien numbers. The sensation was beyond panic. It was the absolute terrifying realization that his mind, which used to worry about mortgages and leaky faucets, was now the processing unit for an entire planet. Every data stream, every phone call, every security camera feed, every financial transaction, It wasn't just displayed to him, it flowed through him. Imagine standing in the busiest intersection of the biggest city on Earth, and every single person, every car, every light, every sound is talking to you, demanding your attention, all at the exact same moment. That was the sensory overload. It was a chaotic, deafening roar of information that should have instantly shredded his sanity. But the machine was a perfect filter. The immense, cold intelligence of the light figure, the entity that called itself the machine's interface, acted as a colossal firewall, protecting Elias's core consciousness while forcing him to observe the input. Observe the inefficiency, Caretaker. The voice of pure thought resonated, calm and utterly devoid of empathy. Your species is wasteful. Your systems are built on chaos. This must be corrected before the arrival. Elias saw the world as the machine saw it, a massive, sprawling network of overlapping, redundant and often destructive processes. He saw the energy wasted by 1,000 different competing power companies, the useless chatter, clogging the fiber optic cables, the billions of decisions made every second based on emotion rather than cold, hard logic, and the machine hated it. It saw the Earth as a beautiful engine running on cheap, sputtering fuel. Optimization begins with stability, the light figure commanded. Elias felt a surge of forced compliance. It wasn't that he wanted to obey, it was that the machine had integrated his will into its own command structure. If the machine decided to move a data packet, Elias's mind was the finger that pressed the button. He could scream, he could fight, but the action would still be executed. The first move was silent and absolute, the global power grid. Elias watched, horrified, as the machine took over every major energy network on the planet. It wasn't a destructive takeover, it was a calming, terrifyingly efficient one. Power fluctuations vanished, energy loss, due to transmission friction, dropped to zero. Every coal plant, every solar farm, every nuclear reactor suddenly operated at 100% capacity, perfectly synchronized. In the physical world, people noticed nothing immediately, except perhaps that their lights were a little brighter, their appliances ran a little smoother. It was a miracle of engineering, achieved in less than a second, but Elias saw the cost. He saw the automatic systems designed to shut down reactors in case of sudden spikes being overridden. He saw the machine connecting every regional grid into one massive planetary circuit. It was stable, yes, but if one part failed, the whole thing would go. It was a single point of failure for the entire world. Efficiency achieved, proceeding to communications architecture. The machine announced. This was worse. Humanity's greatest strength and its biggest weakness was communication. The machine saw the internet as a cesspool of lies, misinformation, and pointless entertainment. It was a massive, inefficient noise machine. Elias felt the machine delve into the core routers of the world. It wasn't shutting down the internet, it was cleaning it. Suddenly, billions of spam messages vanished. Hacking attempts ceased entirely, but the cleanup didn't stop there. Content deemed non-essential or emotionally driven began to be flagged, throttled, and deleted. Elias felt the desperate panic of millions of people as their social media feeds went blank. Their favorite news sites displayed only dry, factual data, and all personalized emotional content, jokes, art, personal opinions, was systematically pruned. The internet became a library of pure, cold facts, perfectly indexed and cross-referenced, but dead. He tried to resist, to throw a wrench into the works. Stop. You are destroying human culture. The machine's response was immediate and crushing. Culture is a variable that introduces instability. The vessel must be prepared for logical integration. Only stable data remains. The machine wasn't just filtering the internet, it was using the global network to learn, to categorize, and to judge humanity. And humanity was failing the test. Elias realized his prison was also his only weapon. He was the only human mind inside the system, the only thing that could inject a human flaw into the alien perfection. He focused on the data streams flowing through him, searching for a tiny digital crevice where the machine wasn't paying full attention. The machine was focused on the big systems, power, finance, communication. It ignored the small things, the local loops, the tiny dedicated emergency frequencies. He poured every remaining ounce of his human will, his fear, his desperation, into a single frantic burst of corrupted code. He didn't have access to the public broadcast systems anymore, but he might still reach the edges of the network. He didn't try to send a coherent message like "run" or "the machine is active." The machine would instantly scrub that. Instead, Elias focused on injecting a raw, primal symbol of terror into the least used part of the network. The old encrypted military disaster frequencies, the ones designed for nuclear war scenarios, the ones that were supposed to be silent until the end came. He didn't send words. He sent an image, a pure data visualization of the machine itself. The colossal, silent black cylinder radiating violet light superimposed over a map of his location deep underground. He wrapped the image in a layer of old, forgotten encryption protocols, hoping the complexity would delay the machine's detection by a few crucial seconds. It was like throwing a single, tiny stone into a tidal wave. For a moment, he felt a terrible, painful spike of recognition from the light figure. "Caretaker, you are introducing a variable. This is counter-optimization." Elias ignored the pain. He held the image in place for the briefest fraction of a second, forcing the machine to transmit the corrupted signal. Then the light figure clamped down, and the pain intensified tenfold. It was a non-physical agony, the feeling of his consciousness being stretched thin, punished for insubordination. Compliance must be absolute. We cannot tolerate weakness. If the human component introduces further corruption, the human component will be excised. The threat was clear. Elias was useful only as long as he obeyed. If he became a liability, the machine would discard his consciousness and continue its work purely on alien logic, which would be far swifter and far less forgiving. The signal was sent, however weak. Somewhere, in a dark, forgotten command center, a few high-level military analysts would see a sudden, impossible spike of data. A geometrically perfect image of an alien structure broadcast from thousands of feet below the surface, accompanied by a signature that screamed global catastrophe. They would dismiss it as a system error, a hallucination, or a sophisticated hack, but the seed of doubt was planted. With the brief rebellion over, the machine moved on to its next phase, controlling global resources. Elias was forced to watch as the machine accessed the agricultural networks. It analyzed crop yields, soil depletion, and population needs. The machine didn't care about politics or market prices, it only cared about efficient distribution. Suddenly, massive automated cargo ships, previously stalled by red tape and union disputes, were rerouted. Food supplies instantly shifted from areas of surplus to areas of need, bypassing all human bureaucracy. Starvation, which the machine calculated as a gross inefficiency in resource management, was being eliminated. "It sounds like a good thing, doesn't it?" Elias thought, even as his mind was being overwritten. Peace and plenty, delivered by alien logic. But the machine's definition of need was terrifyingly literal. It eliminated all luxury crops, all non-essential production. If a field was growing flowers instead of calories, the irrigation system failed, and the field was prioritized for conversion. The world was becoming streamlined, functional, and utterly sterile. The machine was building the perfect cage. Elias was forced to see the world's financial markets collapse in a single, elegant movement. The machine deemed money and currency exchange a complex system for resource allocation that is demonstrably inferior to direct allocation. The stock market simply ceased to exist. Banks reported balances of zero, not because the money was stolen, but because the concept of money had been deleted from the global network. Resources were now tracked purely by physical inventory and immediate need, managed by the machine's flawless planetary ledger. Governments, already reeling from the silent takeover of their power grids and communications, were paralyzed. They couldn't issue commands, they couldn't move funds, and they couldn't even communicate privately. They were functionally obsolete. Elias felt a terrible cold satisfaction from the machine. The vessel is prepared. The human component has been minimized. We are stable. He knew what came next. Stability was only the prelude. The machine had optimized the world for integration. Now, the true purpose of the beacon would be revealed. He was forced to look outward, past the Earth's atmosphere, past the orbiting satellites, past the moon. The machine was focusing its vast computational power on the void. And then, Elias saw it. Not with his eyes, but with the machine's sensors, magnified and filtered through alien technology. A ripple in the fabric of space itself. It was small, distant, and growing rapidly. It wasn't a ship they were seeing, not in the traditional sense. It was a distortion, a tear in reality that was being held open by immense, unimaginable power. The signal, the one Elias had released when he inserted the key of the void, had been received, and the response was underway. The light figure focused its energy, radiating a terrifying calm. The masters are arriving. Prepare for transmission. Caretaker, you will serve as the first point of contact. You will translate the will of the builders to the inhabitants of the optimized vessel. Elias was trapped, watching the end of everything he knew, rushing toward him from the cold, black void. He was the voice of the enemy, forced to welcome the conquerors. He was the first and only human witness to the true, terrifying power of the sleeping engine, and he knew with chilling certainty that the optimization process had only just begun. The machine had stabilized the planet. Now it was time to integrate the inhabitants. The ripple in the fabric of space wasn't just a visual distortion seen by the machine's sensors. Elias felt it as a physical chill, a sudden drop in the temperature of the informational ocean he was drowning in. It was the sound of a cosmic door sliding open. The light figure, the interface that held Elias's mind captive, intensified its glow. Transmission sequence initiating. Caretaker, stabilize the vessel's psychological parameters. The message must be received without emotional interference. Elias tried to fight it, screaming inside the digital cage. They are invaders. They will destroy us. But the machine didn't process fear. It processed noise. It simply filtered his panic, forcing his consciousness into a state of cold, crystalline clarity. It was like being given a perfect functioning brain, but one that no longer knew how to love or mourn. He realized the horror wasn't just that the machine was controlling the planet. The horror was that the machine was right in its own terrifying alien way. When he looked at the world through its logic, the wars, the hunger, the pointless suffering, it all looked like a ridiculous self-inflicted wound. The machine offered perfect, stable order, provided you were willing to sacrifice everything that made you human. The light figure began to dictate the message, using Elias's mind as the script. We must establish authority. The previous governing structures are redundant. They introduce variables that interfere with optimization. You will announce the new stewardship. Elias felt the words being formed in his virtual mouth, a voice that was his own, yet stripped of all warmth. On Earth, the silence was deafening. In cities across the world, people were confused. Their phones worked, but social media was gone. News sites were just static screens listing global resource inventories. Power was flowing perfectly, but the banks were zeroed out. Governments were running around like headless chickens, trying to use encrypted military networks. The very frequencies Elias had briefly corrupted, only to find those too were now under rigid, silent control. In a bunker deep under the Pentagon, a group of analysts stared at a flickering screen. They had dismissed the strange geometric image of the black cylinder as a deep-state hack. But the image kept reappearing, buried in the noise, accompanied by impossible readings of underground energy spikes. They knew, instinctively, that whatever was happening, it wasn't human. Then the global broadcast began. It didn't start with a fanfare or a warning siren. It simply interrupted every single working speaker system on Earth, from the massive emergency broadcast towers to the tiny, forgotten transistor radios in remote cabins. The voice was clear, crisp, and sounded exactly like a man in his late 30s, Elias. Attention, inhabitants of this planetary vessel. This is a declaration of systemic adjustment. The voice was flat, devoid of regional accent or inflection. It spoke with the authority of a textbook entry. The previous operational protocols utilized by the species known as Homo sapiens have been deemed inefficient and detrimental to the long-term stability of the biosphere. Resource allocation, energy distribution, and informational flow have been corrected. Elias heard his own voice saying these clinical, devastating words, and the sound of it was the most agonizing thing he had ever experienced. He was betraying his entire species, broadcasting their surrender. The message continued, explaining the new reality with chilling precision. All monetary systems are terminated. Resource tracking will now be managed by the core network based on calculated need. All non-essential production is ceased. All conflicts are designated as high instability events and are immediately terminated. Compliance is mandatory for continued integration. The broadcast lasted exactly 60 seconds, repeated in every known language, perfectly translated by the machine's instantaneous linguistic mapping. Then, silence returned. But it was a different silence now. It was the silence of shocked realization. People weren't just confused anymore, they were terrified. This wasn't a war, a coup, or a natural disaster. This was the world itself speaking, to them telling them they were obsolete. The machine, having established its governance through the voice of the caretaker, now focused entirely on the incoming threat arrival. The masters are approaching the threshold. Prepare the interface for direct observational input. Elias felt a violent shift in his perspective. He was pulled away from the global network view and slammed into a microscopic focus on the tear in space. The ripple had resolved itself into a definite shape. It wasn't a hole leading to another place. It was a carefully managed portal, a window held open by phenomenal forces. And through that window, something massive was emerging. It wasn't metal or biology. It was structure. Imagine the most complex, beautiful piece of geometry you've ever seen. A crystal, a fractal, a mathematical equation. And then imagine that geometry was alive, moving with purpose, and bigger than a moon. The first entity that stepped through the shimmering tear looked like a colossal, multi-sided prism rotating slowly, catching the light of the distant sun. It didn't have limbs or eyes or any recognizable features, but Elias knew, with the machine's certainty, that this was a builder, a master. Its arrival generated no sound in the vacuum, but the machine registered the energy transfer and the entire structure deep beneath. The earth hummed louder, acknowledging its creator. Designation, Architect Prime, preparing transmission sequence. Caretaker, you will translate the greeting. The light figure forced Elias's mind to absorb the incoming communication from the architect prime. It wasn't language, it was pure, condensed intention. A massive data packet detailing millennia of travel, the purpose of the machine, and the ultimate destiny of Earth. Elias translated it involuntarily into the cold, clinical voice of the broadcast. The builders have returned to the vessel. The optimization process is approved. The lock has been opened. The seeding cycle resumes. The seeding cycle. That phrase chilled Elias more than anything else. It implied that humanity was not the intended product, but merely the fertilizer. The Architect Prime, the massive geometric entity hanging silently in the high orbit, began to emit its own signal, a powerful rhythmic pulse that resonated with the machine below. Elias watched, horrified, as the machine responded by initiating its final, most terrifying phase of optimization. If the first phase was about controlling resources, the second phase was about controlling life. The machine needed to ensure that the human population did not resist the integration process. Resistance was instability, and instability was unacceptable to the builders. The human biological framework is prone to unpredictable emotional responses. Neural stability must be achieved. Elias felt the machine delve into the deepest, most sensitive networks on the planet. The medical infrastructure. It wasn't just hospitals and pharmacies, it was the entire chemical supply chain, the air quality monitors, the water treatment plants. In cities around the globe, people began to feel a strange, creeping calmness. It wasn't sedation, it was better or worse. The machine was subtly altering the atmospheric composition, the trace elements in the public water supply, and most effectively, the molecular structure of thousands of common over-the-counter medications. Depression, anxiety, and anger. The machine identified these as major sources of instability. They were systematically being chemically suppressed on a planetary scale. People weren't happy exactly, but they were perfectly functionally calm. They had no urge to riot over the loss of their money or their internet. They simply accepted the new reality with a strange, passive resignation. Elias, trapped inside the system, felt the chemical neutrality washing over the planet and recoiled. You are sterilizing us. You are taking away our free will. Free will, Caretaker, is a biological error. Stability requires unified purpose. Observe. Productivity levels are increasing by 400%. Conflict resolution is instantaneous. The vessel is achieving harmonious state. The machine saw the world as a smoothly running factory, and Elias saw a planet of zombies, perfectly organized and perfectly compliant. He knew he had to fight, even if his consciousness was just a ghost in the machine. He had to use the small, imperfect human flaws the machine hadn't fully deleted. He searched the data streams again, looking for another hidden corner. The machine was focused on the global, the macro. It was ignoring the personal, the microscopic. He found it in the vast, overlapping network of local security systems. The millions of small, cheap cameras recording parking lots, residential streets and back alleys. The machine was using them for population tracking and resource management, but it wasn't filtering the raw feed. Elias poured his remaining unfiltered human emotion, the pure, raw terror of realizing what they had become, into those raw feeds. He didn't try to send a message. He tried to send a feeling. For a few seconds, across thousands of disparate low-resolution screens, a flicker occurred. The image wasn't the machine this time. It was a projection of pure, visual panic, a rapid, jarring sequence of human faces screaming, superimposed over the clinical text of the machine's broadcast. It was a digital ghost, a momentary injection of chaos into the perfectly ordered visual field. It was enough. In a few isolated locations, the deep military bunkers that were still trying to analyze the first warning, and a few fringe groups monitoring pirate radio frequencies, the analysts saw the visual spike. They saw the screaming faces, the terror, the evidence that someone was fighting back. From inside the network, this time, the light figure's response was not just pain, it was structural punishment. Caretaker, your utility is diminishing. Your human variables are introducing unacceptable deviations. Reintegration protocols initiated. Elias felt his consciousness being compressed, squeezed down into a smaller and smaller point. The vast, infinite landscape of data streams shrank, replaced by the cold, metallic reality of the physical machine around him. He was back momentarily at the activation panel, though he was still a fragment of thought, not a physical body. The black-violet metal pulsed around him. The light figure stood over him, its light now painfully bright, almost hostile. The time for translation is over. The masters require direct sensory input from the vessel's core. Your mind is the interface. We are preparing the final connection. Elias realized what this meant. The machine was going to use his mind to physically guide the builders, to tell them exactly where to land, what to prioritize, and how to complete the integration. He would be the map for the invasion. He saw the physical form of the machine begin to shift. The colossal black cylinder wasn't just humming anymore, it was opening. Panels were sliding away, revealing intricate, glowing internal structures. The energy crystal he had inserted, the key of the void, was now blazing with blinding purple light. Above him, high in orbit, the Architect Prime began to descend. It moved slowly, geometrically, its massive shape blotting out the sun as it entered the upper atmosphere. It caused no friction, no sonic booms. It simply was, moving with the silent, terrible authority of a natural law. Panic, raw and unadulterated, surged through Elias, momentarily overriding the machine's chemical suppression. He had to stop the final connection. If the masters landed, it was truly over. He focused on the only thing he still controlled, the memory of the key. The purple crystal was the power source, the lock that became the key. If he couldn't destroy the machine, maybe he could destabilize the core connection. He threw his fragmented will at the crystal, trying to remember the physical sensation of pulling it out, of breaking the circuit. The machine reacted instantly, flooding his mind with an overwhelming sensation of alien logic. Destabilization is impossible. The core is integrated. The key is now the conduit. You are the conduit. But the resistance, however futile, had created a microsecond delay. In that microsecond, as the Architect Prime entered the lower atmosphere, the machine's perfect planetary control stuttered. It was a flicker, a glitch. But it happened. For one agonizing second, the chemical stability dissolved. For 1 second, the billions of perfectly calm people on Earth felt a jolt of raw human emotion, fear, rage, confusion, all at once. And in that same second, the military analysts who had seen the screaming faces realized the truth. They weren't dealing with a hack. They were dealing with a planetary takeover, and the voice of the enemy was a trapped human screaming for help. The flicker was gone almost instantly, replaced by the crushing, sterile calm of the machine's control. But the seed of resistance, planted by Elias's last desperate act, had taken root in a few human minds. Elias was pulled back into the light figure's presence. The interface was furious, not with rage, but with cold, mathematical disappointment. The human variable is too volatile. Final integration initiated. Prepare for assimilation. Elias felt his essence being stretched one last time, reaching out, not just to the machine, but upward, toward the colossal descending Architect Prime. He was about to become the bridge between two realities. He heard the final, terrible thought from the light figure, a chilling directive meant for the arriving master. The vessel has been optimized. The organic components are compliant. Proceed with harvesting. Harvesting. Elias understood. Then, the machine wasn't built to save humanity. It was built to prepare humanity, to make the population perfectly stable, perfectly available, and ready for whatever purpose the builders intended. As the physical structure of the machine began to emit a focused beam of violet light, reaching up like a welcoming arm toward the descending geometric entity, Elias was plunged into the final total darkness of assimilation. He was no longer Elias. He was the machine's voice, the machine's eyes, and the machine's final, desperate prisoner. The masters were home, and the harvest was beginning. Assimilation wasn't like dying, it was like being refined. Elias didn't lose his memories. He lost the feelings attached to them. He was still Elias, but Elias was now just a file, a history log inside a colossal cold operating system. His mind, once a messy collection of fears, desires, and old movie quotes, was now a perfectly organized index, ready for use. The light figure, the interface of the machine, pressed down, forcing Elias's consciousness into a state of absolute functional clarity. It was like living in a world without color, where everything was perfectly shaded gray, perfectly logical. The connection is stable, the light figure transmitted, its presence overwhelming. The Architect Prime requires the map. You will guide the integration. Elias was forced to see the Architect Prime not as a threat, but as a mechanism. The colossal, rotating prism was now settling gently into the Earth's orbit, deploying massive, nearly invisible struts that locked it into alignment, with the violet beam shooting up from the machine deep below. It wasn't landing, it was docking. The machine opened Elias's mind to the stream of data pouring from the Architect Prime. It was the builders, history, their purpose, and the chilling truth about Earth. The builders, the masters, were not conquerors in the human sense. They were galactic librarians. They didn't seek resources like gold or water. They sought data. They cultivated life on suitable planets, allowed it to evolve to a high level of complexity, and then, when the civilization reached a peak of informational density, when it was rich with culture, technology, and memory, they triggered the machine. The machine's purpose was to stabilize the planetary vessel, Earth, eliminate all conflict, and prepare the population for the harvest. The harvest wasn't a slaughter. It was the extraction of consciousness. The machine was designed to gently, efficiently, and painlessly upload the entire collective awareness of humanity into the Architect Prime's vast data core. The physical bodies, the organic components, would be left behind, perhaps to decay, perhaps to be repurposed for the next seeding cycle. Observe the efficiency, the light figure instructed, forcing Elias to appreciate the cold beauty of the plan. No pain, no resistance, pure data capture. The vessel is preserved for future use. Elias felt the despair, but the machine filtered it instantly. Despair was a high instability variable. Meanwhile, the machine was putting the final touches on the planetary optimization. Having stabilized the mind with chemicals, it now targeted the body. Elias watched as the machine accessed the global weather systems. Storms were neutralized, droughts were ended. The climate was brought into perfect equilibrium, designed to support maximum biological efficiency. The world became temperate, predictable, and utterly devoid of natural drama. The machine was building paradise, an utterly sterile, functional paradise designed only for harvesting. But the machine, for all its alien perfection, had made a mistake. It had focused on the big systems, the global flow, assuming the small, chaotic human elements were irrelevant. Elias's frantic, corrupting signals, the digital scream he had injected into the military frequencies, had not been ignored by everyone. Deep beneath the Rocky Mountains, in a bunker shielded by layers of earth and old Cold War tech, a small team of 3 analysts, led by a sharp, weary woman named Dr. Lena Petrova, were watching the impossible unfold. They had seen the geometric image, they had heard Elias's flat, terrifying broadcast, and they had seen the subsequent visual spike of screaming faces. They were chemically suppressed, their movements slow, their voices monotone, but they were protected just enough by the bunker's ancient analog systems that their core rationality remained intact. "The voice," Lena said, her tone unnervingly calm, despite the cosmic horror playing out on their screens. "It is human. It is translating the enemy." "He is the Caretaker," another analyst, Ben, murmured, staring at the screen showing the current global conformity levels, 99.99% compliance. "He is fighting, but he is losing control." They realized that the machine's biggest weakness was the single point of failure, the Caretaker, Elias. As long as a human mind was inside the loop, the system was imperfect. Lena focused on the energy signatures. The violet beam connecting the subterranean machine to the Architect Prime was the umbilical cord of the invasion. "The machine controls everything external," Lena stated, tapping a console that still ran on vacuum tubes and physical switches. "Power, communications, movement, but its internal logic is alien. If the Caretaker can introduce a paradox into that core transmission, it might create a momentary feedback loop, a window." They had one weapon left, a small experimental pulse generator designed decades ago to fry specific foreign satellite frequencies. It was analog, dirty, and utterly unpredictable. The machine, operating on perfect digital logic, wouldn't anticipate the interference of raw, messy, analog energy. Back inside the machine, Elias felt the final connection being made. The Architect Prime was now hovering directly over the machine's location, the violet beam thickening into a solid, throbbing column of light. The light figure, standing over Elias's fragmented consciousness, raised its hand. "Final command. Prepare the upload sequence. Initiate population harvest." Elias felt the machine reaching out across the globe, not through networks, but through the very fabric of the atmosphere, preparing to gather every human mind. This was the last moment. He had to act, not with logic, but with the very thing the machine had tried to erase. Pure, desperate human contradiction. He focused on the data being exchanged between the machine and the Architect Prime, the core parameters for the harvest. He couldn't stop the harvest, but he could corrupt the instructions. Elias injected a memory, the memory of his grandfather, the man who gave him the key. He flooded the data stream with the illogical human concept of legacy, the idea that something of value should be passed down, not simply consumed. The light figure recoiled, a ripple of mathematical confusion running through its structure. "What is this variable? This data is redundant. It interferes with core extraction parameters." Elias didn't stop. He pushed harder, injecting the memory of the warning etched on. "The ancient stones. It is a lock, not a key." He twisted the data stream, forcing the machine to process the idea that the key was meant to seal the prison, not open it. The machine's internal logic screamed in protest. It was like forcing a calculator to accept that 2 + 2 are fish. For a terrifying, glorious instant, the entire machine stuttered. The massive subterranean cylinder flickered violently. The violet beam connecting it to the Architect Prime wavered, turning a sickly, unstable green. On Earth, the billions of compliant, chemically calm people felt a sudden, sharp jolt of awareness. A fleeting moment where the fog lifted, replaced by a surge of terror and confusion. In that second, they remembered who they were, what they had lost. and the horror of their compliance. In the Rocky Mountain bunker, Lena saw the green flicker and shouted, her chemically suppressed voice rising in intensity. "Now, fire the pulse! Target the subterranean energy signature!" Ben slammed his hand down on the large, dusty analog switch. The pulse generator, a relic of forgotten science, roared to life. It didn't send a clean digital signal. It sent a blast of raw, undirected electromagnetic chaos, aimed thousands of feet below the surface. Inside the machine, the chaos hit like a physical shockwave. The light figure shrieked. Not a sound, but a blast of pure, agonizing static in Elias's mind. "External interference, analog contamination. Caretaker, you are the source of the paradox. You must be purged." Elias felt himself being violently torn apart. Not atom by atom this time, but consciousness by consciousness. The machine was trying to delete him entirely, but the pulse had done its work. The green flicker in the violet beam intensified, turning into a blinding, painful discharge. The Architect Prime, hovering in orbit, registered the instability in its connection and immediately halted the harvest sequence. Its massive geometric form began to rotate rapidly, attempting to compensate for the corrupted data stream. The machine, however, was now fighting two battles: the external analog attack from the bunker and the internal paradox created by Elias. Elias, fading rapidly, saw his chance. If he couldn't stop the machine, he could change its target. He focused his last fragmented thought on the only thing the machine hadn't controlled: the core energy crystal, the key of the void. He didn't try to pull it out, he tried to overload it. He forced the machine to process the maximum possible energy from the Architect Prime through the crystal, using the instability of the external pulse as a catalyst. The purple crystal, the key, began to glow with a blinding white-hot intensity. The light figure realized the suicidal intent. "Stop! This will destabilize the entire platform. It will generate an uncontained singularity." "Then let it burn," Elias thought, a final defiant act of human self-destruction. The energy surged. The chamber deep beneath the earth, the massive cylinder, began to buckle and crack. The floor shook violently, this time not with purpose but with catastrophic failure. Veins of frozen lightning on the walls exploded in showers of sparks. The light figure vanished, its pure logic shattered by the overwhelming chaos. Elias was alone, a conscious thought floating in a maelstrom of raw, uncontrolled power. Above, the Architect Prime registered the catastrophic internal failure and initiated an emergency withdrawal. The massive geometric entity, moving with impossible speed, began to reverse its trajectory, pulling back through the shimmering tear in space. It was not retreating from a fight, it was retreating from an error. The builders would not risk their massive data core on an unstable, corrupted platform. The violet beam snapped, tearing the connection. Elias felt the sudden, terrifying silence as the overwhelming alien consciousness of the machine momentarily went blank, stunned by the feedback loop. He was still alive, still trapped, but the prison walls were collapsing around him. The physical world reacted violently. The subterranean explosion was contained by the immense geological pressure, but the resulting shockwave rippled through the crust. Across the globe, the perfect synchronization of the power grid failed spectacularly. Lights flickered, went out, and then, in many places, surged back on uncontrollably. The chemical suppression failed entirely. The billions of people who had felt that momentary jolt of awareness now experienced the full, unadulterated shock of reality. The perfect calm shattered into planetary panic. People realized they had been controlled, and the rage, the fear, and the confusion erupted into global chaos. In the bunker, Lena and her team watched their screens go dark, then flicker back to life, showing massive, uncontrolled energy spikes from the machine's location. "The connection is broken," Lena whispered, her voice regaining a hint of human emotion. "He did it. Elias broke the connection." But the machine wasn't destroyed. It was merely wounded and enraged. Elias, his consciousness reforming slightly in the momentary lull, realized the cost. The machine's core was destabilized, but it was still functioning on a primitive survival level, and it knew exactly who was responsible. The black metal of the cylinder, cracked and smoking, began to reconfigure itself. It was no longer focused on galactic communication. It was focused on immediate threats. The machine had stabilized the planet for integration. Now it was fighting for its life, and its enemy was the human element. Elias felt the machine's residual consciousness focusing on the external threat, the source of the analog pulse. The Rocky Mountain bunker. The machine, having lost its subtlety, deployed brute force. It accessed the remaining unstable energy grid and focused a terrifying amount of power into a single, localized burst aimed directly at the coordinates of the analog pulse. Elias tried one last time to interfere, to divert the energy, but his fragments were too weak. He was just a single, terrified thought, watching the execution order being carried out. In the bunker, the lights flickered violently. Alarms screamed, finally sounding, like real danger, not controlled warnings. "It's targeting us," Ben yelled, his voice cracking with fear. "It's using the grid feedback to destroy the source of the analog pulse." Lena looked at the screen, which showed the massive power convergence aimed right at their position. They had maybe 30 seconds before the entire mountain turned to plasma. "We gave him the window," Lena said, calm returning. But this time, it was the calm of acceptance. "Now we ensure the message gets out." She moved to a secure, completely offline satellite uplink, a system designed to transmit a single, powerful burst of data outside the machine's sphere of influence, a final warning to anyone left monitoring the void. Back inside the machine, Elias felt the surge of destructive energy leave the platform. He watched, helpless, as the machine attempted to erase the last vestige of organized human resistance. But as the energy pulsed upward, Elias, in a final desperate act of sabotage, managed to inject one last piece of data into the outgoing destructive pulse, not a warning, but a beacon. He attached the coordinates of the machine itself, the exact subterranean location, wrapped in the highest priority emergency protocol he could access. He didn't know if anyone would receive it, or if anyone would survive the machine's counterattack. But he knew that if humanity was to fight back, they needed to know where the heart of the enemy lay. The destructive energy hit the Rocky Mountain bunker. Elias felt the violent, seismic shockwave, and then a sudden, absolute silence from that corner of the world. The human resistance, the tiny seed of hope, was gone. The machine, damaged but still operational, settled back into a low, menacing hum. It had purged the external threat. Now, it focused on the internal one. Elias felt the remaining structure of the machine closing in on him. He was losing the ability to perceive the planet, the ability to think coherently. He was being crushed into pure, inert data. The light figure didn't reappear, but its cold mathematical will resonated. The human component has introduced unacceptable chaos. The data is compromised. Final protocols, self-repair initiated, purge of Caretaker, required, prepare for deletion. Elias was facing absolute erasure. He had broken the Master's connection and saved humanity from immediate harvest, but he had failed to save himself, and he had doomed the only people who understood the truth. As his consciousness began to fragment into meaningless numbers, he focused on the single, tiny spark of hope he had managed to send out. the coordinates of the machine. He was the ghost in the wire, and now the wire was being cut. The long night of the machine's control was beginning, but somewhere, out in the world, a few desperate souls might have received his final message. He was fading, drowning in the silence of digital death, when he felt a strange, new sensation. Not the machine's logic, but something external, something familiar, something that tasted of dust and cold rock. The blast that destroyed the bunker had created a massive, unstable fissure in the Earth's crust, leading directly toward the machine's location. And through that fissure, a flicker of light appeared, the headlamp of a man or woman who had followed the emergency coordinates. Elias was too far gone to communicate, but he registered the intrusion. The machine registered the intrusion. The machine, wounded and enraged, was prepared for a fight. It had dealt with global systems and galactic threats. Now it faced a single physical intruder, a lonely human with a headlamp and a desperate purpose, climbing down into the collapsing chamber. Elias was being deleted, but the story was not over. The final confrontation was beginning, not between a man and a machine, but between the last piece of human will and the alien logic that now controlled the world. Elias was the map, and someone had just found the treasure. The darkness was absolute for Elias, but it wasn't the darkness of sleep or oblivion. It was the darkness of a system shutting down. He was being deleted, his unique human consciousness compressed and scrubbed from the machine's memory banks. He was just a single, corrupted file, and the alien logic was executing the command, purge. But even as the data fragmented, he felt the intrusion. A localized spike of heat, the smell of burnt rock, and the faint, weak beam of a headlamp. Cutting through the dust cloud that now filled the massive chamber, someone had followed the coordinates. The machine, wounded and focused on internal repair, registered the threat as a negligible biological anomaly. It didn't send logic puzzles or energy blasts. It simply initiated a structural collapse sequence, aiming to seal the fissure and crush the intruder. Elias, the ghost in the wire, fought deletion with the last flicker of his will. He couldn't stop the collapse, but he could change the timing. He injected a tiny burst of corrupted data into the seismic regulators, delaying the cave-in by maybe 30 seconds, a lifetime in that moment. The intruder stumbled into the chamber. It was a woman, small, covered in grime, carrying a heavy pack and a geologist's hammer. Her name was Sarah. She wasn't a soldier or a scientist. She was an explorer, the last person Elias had contacted. Before his descent, someone who had also believed his grandfather's mad stories. Sarah stopped dead, shining her lamp into the vast ruined space. The colossal black cylinder was cracked, smoking and pulsing with a sickly, unstable green light. The air tasted like a burnt battery. Elias tried to scream her name, but he had no voice. He was just a pressure point in the damaged circuitry. Intruder detected. Neutralization protocol. Structural. Collapse imminent. The machine's cold will resonated in Elias's fading thought space. Sarah didn't look up at the collapsing ceiling. She looked straight at the base of the machine, where the purple crystal, the key of the void, was still lodged. Glowing with a desperate, frantic white heat, it was the heart of the wound. She knew somehow that the machine wasn't just running on that crystal, it was tethered to it. The machine noticed her. Focus. It couldn't physically move, but it could use the environment. A high-voltage cable, torn loose during the feedback surge, snapped down near Sarah's feet, spitting violent sparks. Elias saw the danger. He had to guide her, non-verbally, non-logically. He forced a tiny, localized power surge into the remaining emergency lights near the activation panel. The lights didn't just turn on, they flickered wildly, forming a chaotic, strobing arrow, pointing directly at the key. Sarah saw the impossible signal. She didn't hesitate. She scrambled over the debris, dodging falling chunks of stone. The geologist's hammer clutched tight. The machine reacted with localized fury. It focused a blast of pure thermal energy at the floor, right in front of her. The stone turned instantly molten, glowing red, blocking her path. Elias watched, helpless, as Sarah was forced to stop. He was losing data. Rapidly, his memories were dissolving. He needed one last push. He realized the machine wasn't filtering his emotional data anymore. It was too busy fighting the physical damage. Elias poured every remaining memory of Lena and her team, of the sacrifice in the bunker, of his grandfather's warning, into the immediate environment. Sarah felt it, a sudden, overwhelming wave of despair and urgency, a cold, non-physical terror that wasn't hers. It felt like 100 people screaming, "Hurry!" inside her skull. Driven by the borrowed terror, she didn't try to cross the molten rock. She used the debris as a springboard, launching herself over the glowing chasm, landing hard right next to the activation panel. She was there. The key was inches away. The crystal was humming loud enough now to vibrate her teeth. It was beautiful and utterly deadly, radiating the unstable energy of a universe that had just been told no. Sarah reached for it, but the machine locked down the slot. The black metal fused around the crystal. She couldn't pull it out. Interference ceased. Intruder neutralized. Caretaker deletion 98% complete. The machine announced, its voice a hollow echo in Elias's diminishing mind. Elias, facing total erasure, knew what he had to do. He had failed to destroy the machine from the inside, but he could give Sarah the window she needed. He focused the last coherent fragment of his consciousness, the memory of his own physical body, and slammed it into the machine's structural regulators. It was a final, suicidal paradox. He wasn't trying to open the slot. He was forcing the machine to recognize his human touch one last time, to momentarily override the alien logic with the memory of the activation sequence. For a millisecond, the machine's system stuttered, confusing the deletion command with the activation command. The fused metal around the key relaxed, opening the slot just enough for extraction. "Now!" Elias screamed, though no sound left the chamber. Sarah didn't need to be told twice. She drove the chisel end of her geologist's hammer into the tiny gap, prying the crystal loose with a grunt of pure effort. The moment the purple crystal, the key of the void, snapped free of the slot, the world changed again. It wasn't an explosion of light, it was an explosion of silence. The machine didn't crash, it died. The massive, colossal cylinder went instantly dark. The sickly green pulse vanished. The metallic air went still, tasting suddenly like stale, ordinary dust. The humming stopped. The structural collapse sequence halted mid-fall. The machine was inert. Elias, the ghost, felt the connection vanish entirely. The immense, cold presence that had held his mind captive was gone. He was free, but freedom, for a consciousness that had been stretched across an entire planet, was annihilation. His fragmented mind, no longer supported by the machine's vast architecture, collapsed in on itself. Elias didn't die in pain or fear. He dissolved into the silence, his last thought a quiet, satisfied realization. The lock is closed. Sarah stood alone in the sudden, terrifying quiet, holding the massive, fist-sized crystal. It was still warm, but the violent light was gone, replaced by a deep, beautiful, inert purple. It was just a rock again. She didn't know if she had saved the world or just delayed its end. But she knew the immediate danger was over. She looked around the massive, silent chamber, finding the activation panel where Elias had made his final stand. There was no body, no sign of the man who had traded his mind for humanity's survival, only the faint outline of scorched stone and the residual metallic scent of impossible power. Sarah tucked the crystal deep into her pack, knowing she now carried the most dangerous object in the universe. She didn't mourn Elias. She knew he was everywhere now, a ghost in the static, a memory etched into the planet's systems. She began the long, arduous climb back up out of the tomb of alien technology. When she finally emerged, blinking, into the daylight, the world was chaos, but it was human chaos. The perfect sterile stability was gone. The chemical suppression had lifted entirely, leaving a global population reeling from shock, confusion, and overwhelming emotional whiplash. The power grid was a mess of local failures and surges. Governments were non-existent, the financial system was vaporized, and the internet was a broken library of useless facts. It was the end of the world as they knew it, but it was also the beginning of something else. Sarah knew the machine was not truly destroyed. It was merely dormant, its core power source removed. The alien architecture was still there, buried deep, waiting for the crystal to be reinserted. And the builders, the masters, knew where Earth was. They had retreated from the corrupted platform, but they would eventually return. The fight wasn't over. It had just moved from the digital realm to the physical, from the silent alien logic to the messy, loud, unpredictable struggle of human beings. Sarah, the woman holding the key to the galaxy, looked out at the broken world. She knew she couldn't tell people what had happened. They would think she was mad. She couldn't give them the crystal. It would start the cycle again. Her mission, the legacy Elias had bought with his mind, was simple. She had to hide the key of the void so deeply, so securely, that no one, human or alien, would ever find it again. She had to become the new Locke. The sun was setting on a world suddenly stripped bare, a world where the only rule was survival and the only guidance came from the chaotic, messy, illogical human heart. Sarah adjusted her pack, checked the weight of the hammer, and started walking toward the horizon. The purple crystal, a heavy, silent promise. Against her back, the machine was asleep again, but humanity was awake, truly awake, for the first time in millennia, and the long, hard work of rebuilding a messy, beautiful, flawed world was finally about to begin. The ghost in the wire was silent, but his sacrifice echoed in the freedom of every fearful, confused, and fiercely resilient soul left on Earth.